Hello and welcome to topic two. And this is the first lecture for topic two. And we're going to be taking a look at perspectives on justice in this lecture. So this week you'll be watching two lectures, and the two lectures will be summarizing the six justice perspectives that are discussed in the second half of chapter one in your textbook. In this lecture, lecture one, we're going to be taking a look at the first three: crime control perspective, rehabilitation, and due process perspective. And then in the second lecture, we're going to look at the other three, which are the non-interventionist perspective, restorative justice, and equal justice. This week in your discussion, you are going to be applying these concepts, and I'll talk more about that at the end of lecture two. And I want to encourage you, or not encourage you, but to remind you that the reading lectures, you have a lecture on the quizzes, but you also have a lecture on, the reading quizzes. And so make sure that you actually read the textbook for a more in-depth coverage of these perspectives, because this lecture is designed to give you a summary of the perspectives, but you'll learn more in reading in the textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the broad goal of the criminal justice system is social control. And what that means is that most everyone agrees that the goal of the criminal justice system is to maintain safety and order by preventing behavior that threatens society. The thing is that how best to achieve that goal, how best to achieve safety and order, how best to identify what are in fact behaviors that are threatening to society depends on the perspective and beliefs that you have or a person has about the criminal justice system. And that's where this half of the chapter is going to come into play, because these different perspectives offer different answers to these questions. And so, for example, what is the best way to prevent threatening behavior? Well, depending on your perspective, you might think, like if you're from a crime control perspective, you might think that the best way to prevent that behavior is getting more police on the street, right? And having more severe consequences for bad behavior, for criminal behavior. On the other hand, if you're from a rehabilitationist perspective, you might think that the best way to prevent criminal behavior is to give people an alternative to criminal behavior, right? That give them an opportunity to get a job that pays well, etc. How you answer the question of what behaviors actually pose a threat are different from different perspectives. So we're going to be learning about the non-interventionist perspective, and they basically argue that non-violent victimless crimes such as prostitution or drug use or drug purveying of drugs, the distribution of drugs, they don't really see that as a behavior that threatens society, although clearly other perspectives disagree. And the idea of to what extent are we willing to go to maintain safety and order. And so that in order to get order, are we willing to trample upon the rights of those accused of crime? So kind of the battle between order and liberty, which we're going to be talking about when we get to the due process perspective. And so as I'm sort of, threading throughout this first slide, the perspectives on justice help us answer these questions. And as your textbook points out, that given the complexity of criminal justice, no one view dominates, right? That most people, when thinking about how to achieve the goals of the criminal justice system, that they might say that the crime control perspective offers some really good points, but so does the due process perspective, so does the equal justice perspective, etc. And here is a handy pie chart that you can refer to as we are discussing each of these perspectives. It's kind of a nice little summary to jumpstart your brain in terms of thinking about them. And so you've got the equal justice perspective up here: rehabilitation, non-intervention, restorative justice, crime control, and due process. So let's go ahead and take a look at crime control, rehabilitation, and due process perspective. Okay, so let's start with the first perspective, which is the crime control perspective. Okay, so we're going to start thinking about the crime control perspective by reading a quote from the author James Q. Wilson, who is oftentimes known as the father of the crime control perspective. And so, what I want us to do is, I want us to, I'll read the quote for you, and then I want you to actually pause the video. And I want you to, take out hopefully you're taking notes right now. So I want you to take out, your notes and pen. And I just want you to sort of think about this quote and kind of interpret in your own words what you think this quote means. And then once you're done doing that, come back to the video, and then we'll sort of walk through what James Q. Wilson was trying to communicate with this quote. And so what James Q. Wilson wrote was that wicked people exist. Nothing avails except to set them apart from innocent people. And many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their chances, ponder our reaction to wickedness as a clue to what they might profitably do. All right, so pause the tape and then come back, and then let's talk about what this quote means. Hey, welcome back. Okay. So the first thing that James Q. Wilson is getting at, and he's an author of the book Thinking About Crime, and this was written in 1975, and this book, comes as a response to rising crime rates in the United States. Now, right now, crime rates are relatively low in the United States. I mean, we're going to be learning about how there's been a recent uptick, particularly in homicides, and maybe explanations for why that is. But in the 1970s, 80s, and peaking in the early 1990s, crime was, really much higher at those time periods than it is today in the United States, where it's much lower. And so Wilson wrote this book sort of asking the question, like, why is there so much crime? Why are people committing crimes? And he came up with this idea that criminals are just like other people. They're rational actors, and they engage in a cost-benefit analysis. And if the rewards are greater than the costs of committing the crime, then they're going to engage in the crime. That's basically sort of what's summarized in this quote. He basically says that there are sort of three types of people. There are wicked people, like evil people. And when it comes to evil people, they're just like, there's no reasoning with them. They are just evil. They're born that way. So nothing avails except that you got to set them apart. You just got to get them out of society, okay? There's other people that are just innocent people, like no matter what. They're like angels, not evil devils, right? And like no matter what, they're never going to engage in criminal behavior, right? They're angels. Well, most of us aren't devils, and most of us aren't angels. Most of us are these people in the middle, okay? And so he says, and many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their chances, right? So most people are like looking around at society and going, who's committing these crimes, right? And how are we treating those people who engage in criminal behavior and in hurtful and harmful behavior? Are they being detected immediately? Are the crimes solved? Are they swiftly punished and put away for a long period of time? They're like, oh shoot, if that's what's happening, right? I'm watching and I'm not gonna engage in that. But if you're looking around like, oh man, you're rarely caught, you get a little like slap on the wrist, you're like, giddy up, I'm gonna engage in some crimes, okay? And so that is sort of in a nutshell, what the crime control perspective is. The vast majority of us are not evil or angels, but we are rational actors. We're sitting around doing a cost-benefit analysis to see whether or not we can get away with crime. Okay, so the main focus of the crime control perspective is preventing crime through criminal sanctions. When they ask the question, why do people commit crimes, as was indicated from our last slide, they think that people commit crimes because criminals are rational actors just like everybody else, and that they engage in a rational calculus. They ask themselves, what are the benefits I will get from committing this crime, and what are some of the costs associated with committing this crime? Ultimately, they're asking, can I get away with it? Because if I can get away with it, then if I rob somebody, if I, burglarize somebody's house, I'm going to get a benefit because I'm not likely to get caught. From the crime control perspective, the best way to prevent crime is to make the response to crime swift, certain, and severe. Okay? And also to remove legal roadblocks that makes it a lot less swift, right? Legal roadblocks are oftentimes standing in the way of a swift administration of so-called justice. Let's talk about the first thing first, that make the response swift, certain, and severe. The crime control perspective thinks that people should have a high level of certainty that if they commit a crime, that they're going to get caught. Okay, because if you feel certain that you're going to get caught, you're probably not going to engage in the crime. And so, crime control perspective are oftentimes wanting more money spent on law enforcement, more boots on the ground in terms of police forces. They also think that the response to crime should be swift. Not only is it certain that you're going to get caught, but once you are caught, that you are going to basically, experience a consequence for your criminal act in a swift manner. So we'll talk in a second about how the crime control model feels that there's a lot of legal roadblocks, a lot of rights that are afforded the criminally accused that make it difficult to have a swift administration of justice. And then finally, they want the punishment to be severe, not just a slap on the wrist, okay? Because they basically think if you're certain you're going to get caught and you're going to get your consequence swiftly and the consequence is severe, it makes the cost of engaging in criminal behavior extremely high, and the rational actor then would not do that. From removing legal roadblocks, we're going to be learning, throughout the course of this semester, that there are, Amendments 4 through 8 in the United States Bill of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are, dedicated to the rights of the criminally accused. You can't be searched without probable cause, that you have a right to remain silent at your trial, that you have a right to a jury trial, right? That your punishment can't be cruel or unusual, et cetera, et cetera. And so that, our Constitution is designed in such a way to make sure that criminals' rights are protected. But oftentimes, the crime control folks think that those protections are actually making it a lot harder to fight crime. An example that they use is this thing called, the exclusionary rule. The exclusionary rule is that any evidence that's collected is a product of an illegal search. It's inadmissible in court. It's excluded from court proceedings, right? And crime control people are like, they see that as a legal roadblock, right? You got clearly somebody who's engaged in some sort of criminal activity, but because of some error that cops engaged in, you can't use the contraband that was found at trial. And so that's a good example of the crime control wanting to get rid of legal roadblocks in order to make criminal justice more swiftly, administered. Now, there are a lot of criticisms of the crime control perspective. One criticism is the vast majority of people, or a large portion of people who commit crimes, are not in their right mind, right? They are either, on drugs, right, on alcohol, suffer from some sort of mental illness, and so they are not necessarily engaging in some sort of rational cost-benefit analysis. Also, that we have a lot of severe penalties in the United States, right? Truth in sentencing, we're going to be learning about. Yet people are still committing crimes, and the recidivism rate, that's repeat offenders, is quite high in the United States. And so even though we've had sort of more of a crime control perspective in the United States in the last 20 plus years, that we're still seeing that crimes are still, that people are still committing crimes, and that we do have repeat offenders. However, we have seen a reduction in crime during that time. Crime control people say that's because of that we've had swifter and more severe punishments. Let's turn our sights now to the rehabilitation perspective. And historically in the United States, the rehabilitation perspective actually preceded the crime control perspective. And in many ways, the crime control perspective is a response to, or almost a backlash against, the rehabilitation perspective. So let's take a look at this perspective. So the main focus of the rehabilitation perspective is addressing the social conditions that cause crime and treating and caring for people who commit crimes. Thus, the idea of rehabilitation. They want to rehabilitate the social conditions that are contributing to crime commission. And they also want to rehabilitate or treat people because they see them as in need of treatment because they are engaging in criminal behavior. Now, from this perspective, when they ask the question, why do people commit crime? They say that people commit crime because it's an expression of frustration and anger that's caused by social inequality. Okay? So, one thing they really focus on is poverty. That when it comes to economic inequality, which is a type of social inequality, they see that that the playing field is not really equal in capitalism, and that you have poor communities that don't have wealth to pass on to their kids, and that they live in poverty, and the communities that they live in are disorganized. And poverty, leads to, having to work many low-paying jobs that can lead to struggles within maintaining a family and family continuity, etc. And also poverty can lead to, like poor schools, since our school systems are derived a part of how schools are paid for is through property taxes. So the more valuable your property is, the more taxes you're going to get for your schooling. And so economic inequality can play itself out in poor schools. And so that if there aren't economic opportunities, if you feel like you go to school, but your education isn't really going to get you a job that's going to make you money, you might get really angry and frustrated about that. And when you're angry and frustrated, you're going to engage in antisocial behavior, criminal behavior. Furthermore, if you don't feel like you have an opportunity to actually survive, according to sort of more conventional means, getting a job, getting an education, right? Because you might just feel like unemployment's so high in your community that you're going to turn to criminal endeavors in order to survive. And so from the rehabilitation perspective, they say that the best way to prevent crime is to address the conditions that cause crime. There's sort of, in your textbook, it says you can either pay now or pay later. And if you pay now, if you make investments into improving the conditions, reducing poverty, increasing educational opportunity, increasing job training, if you pay at the front end, that's going to prevent a lot of people from not having those things, not having jobs, not having good job training, not having good education, and that they're going to turn to crime. And then the cost to the community and to society broadly of trying people, convicting people, incarcerating people is ginormous, right? And so they're like, let's invest in the front end so we don't end up paying more in the back end, okay? And also, they another way of the best way to prevent crime is to treat the offender, okay? Treat the offender like that. They give the offender the tools they need to get better, to engage in pro-social behavior rather than antisocial criminal behavior. And that could be education, counseling, job training, dealing with addictions, dealing with alcoholism, crisis management, etc. Okay? Now, there are criticisms of this perspective as well. That one criticism is that a lot of people grow up in poverty. A lot of people grow up in conditions of racism because they see racism as another contributor to this. And they don't commit crimes, right? And also people grow up in they're white, grow up, advantages that might come with the privileges of being white. They grow up in wealthy circumstances, but they still commit crimes, right? And so, they sort of see that people are making personal choices, and they're not just the product of their conditions. The last perspective we're going to look at in part 1 lecture is the due process perspective. So when we talk about the due process perspective, it's important to define what we mean by due process. One way of defining due process is to say that due process is the requirement that legal matters must be resolved by established rules and principles, okay? And that is a cornerstone of any democratic society, and that's a cornerstone of the American society. That when somebody in particular is convicted of a crime or charged with a crime, there has to be a known, rules and procedures about how that person is going to be treated, right? And so, like in the United States, that when you're arrested, you're read your Miranda rights. that if you're searched, it must be with a warrant or based on probable cause. When you're tried, that you get a jury and that there's a certain procedure regarding jury selection, so on. Okay? So the due process perspective is really the main focus of it is that procedural fairness, right? That we have processes in place and that those processes need to be applied in a non-discriminatory way. And they also need to be like actually applied. You can't skip over or shortchange the process that all of those accused of crimes are afforded by our Constitution. And so the due process perspective focuses on that no discrimination, right? That people should be treated fairly, and that everybody should have a right to the fair procedures, and that there should be a full application of due process that's found in the civil liberties in the Fourth Amendment through the Eighth Amendment, right? That we shouldn't say, well, usually you have a right to remain silent, but we're going to beat a confession out of you this time, right? No. That is a violation of due process. Now, from this perspective, they ask the question, well, why do people commit crimes? And the due process perspective says, look, our perspective is really not focused on or really concerned on what are the causes of crime. However, they do say that when you don't have due process, that the absence of due process or discrimination in the application of fair procedure, that it increases a lack of trust in the criminal justice system. And basically saying, look, if the rules don't apply to those who are working in the criminal justice system, cops can do whatever they want, prosecutors don't have to follow the rules, then why should I follow the rules, right? And so it can jeopardize the social contract that we have, right, with our government. And so you might ask, well, why is the due process perspective so concerned with the vigorous protection of the rights of the accused? I mean, they're accused, they're probably guilty anyway. Well, from their perspective, they say, look, the state is mighty, and for those of you who took my civil liberties class, you've heard this before. I'm like a broken record. The state is mighty, and the individual is weak, okay? Particularly those who are accused of crimes. It's easy to say, well, an upstanding citizen gets their civil liberties, right? But a criminal, they're up to no good. They don't really deserve their liberties, right? No. That the state is mighty, the individual is weak, and what the state can do to an individual who's accused of a crime, it can be devastating in terms of their life. Not just their life, but the life of their family, really the life of the community. And so for them, due process is a necessary check on the power of the state. They're not saying that the state shouldn't arrest people, search people, try people, convict people, and sentence people. They're saying, yes, they should do that. That's necessary for the maintenance of a democratic society. But they must do it according to the procedures, the rules and principles and procedures that dictate the workings of the criminal justice system. From them, it's a greater crime to punish the innocent than to let the criminal go free, because they do know that, and this is something that rankles the crime control people, they do know that when you follow due process, errors are going to be made and the guilty may go free. But the harm associated with the innocents being convicted of a crime they did not commit is so grave that it justifies that sometimes the criminal will be let free in the greater name of protecting these due process. And we know that innocent people are convicted, right? Right now I'm watching the great documentary. I mean, I haven't gotten to the end of it, so no spoilers, right? It's like 13 hours long, called The Staircase. And it's a great documentary made by a French filmmaker that chronicles the trial of Michael Peterson. And I'm at the point in the documentary where we're sort of looking at the failure for the prosecutor and the crime lab to follow fair procedure, right? And I know from reading your questionnaires that a lot of y'all are into the documentaries, the real crime stories, and we all know that the innocent people are convicted. We know because with the advances in DNA technology, we know that people are behind bars, and then when we get the DNA technology, we know that they're actually were wrongly accused. All right, that's it for the first three, and we'll come together soon to take a look at the other three. Thanks a lot for listening. I really appreciate it.